This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a very quick word. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to come to all or even most of the conference. But my name is Bill Marsh. I'm the director of the Institute of Germanic and Advanced Studies. I just wanted to welcome you here. I'm absolutely delighted to see such a diverse crowd in all senses, nationalities, disciplines especially. And it's exactly the kind of work that we enjoy doing here that we want to continue doing. Very interdisciplinary work, bringing juxtapositions of heterogeneities, is one way I might put it, in a very fruitful way. And we're delighted also, of course, to welcome Chris Frayling here to give this lecture. Simon's going to give a bit of a more complete introduction to Chris. I'm not sure whether you'll have the opportunity during the 3 days to actually thank and indeed acclaim all the organisers of this magnificent conference. So I think we may do that now. Then thank Simon and Katya for this great event.
Well, I should actually sort of reply and say, well, you don't get any kind of conference without people coming along and giving great papers and talks and joining in. So thank you very much. Yes, so this will be rather brief, just because we all would much prefer to listen to Christopher speaking rather than me. You've probably already heard way too much from me. So I should start by saying that this talk tonight is only happening through the. Let me flick back. Is only actually through the help of the John Coffin Trust. That name is not made up and is not ironic at all. But we should be very thankful for them. We should also be very thankful for the fact that Christopher found my persistence in asking him to come amusing rather than annoying.
I was expecting my jugular with interest.
So very briefly, probably most of you that have any serious interest in vampire literature will already know Christopher from his seminal work, should we say, on vampires, from John Polidori to Bram Stoker. He's actually written 18 books on films and popular culture, from the vampire up to the mad scientist, which somebody did actually quote during one of their talks, and of course the birth of the nightmare from which this talk comes. And also he has a book due out next year from Thames and Hudson called Yellow Peril, Nasty Chinaman in literature and film. The title of that alone makes me want to go out and buy it now. Very briefly, the talk tonight will be Sir Christopher talking for about 15 or 20 minutes as a start, and then we'll actually show the program, which lasts about 45 minutes. And once that is done, then we will have questions, thoughts and comments from the floor. So that's quite enough for me. Over to Sir.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. This is the Vampire. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you to the Coffin Trust. I never thought I'd hear myself say that. Thank you very much to the Coffin Trust for making all this possible. It's very, very gratifying to see the rising and risen generation of researchers and lecturers and professors looking at this subject. Over 50 papers by my count. Because it reminds me of when I first started working on the first edition of this book, which came out in 1978. In the British Museum reading room, as was, where Jonathan Harker sets out at the beginning of Dracula, the big round reading room. And one really was treated with kid gloves when one was studying the Gothic in those days. I mean, it really struck me very forcibly listening to the last 3 sessions and looking at the titles of the others, how recent a lot of the interest is comparatively. I mean, when I was studying this, Dracula was treated as a very second-11 novel, sort of poor man's Wilkie Collins. Varney the Vampire was filed under Thomas Prescott Prest in the British Museum catalogue, and I believe it was me actually that attributed it to Rymer, because someone found a scrapbook belonging to James Malcolm Rymer of all his reviews. He was an indefatigable writer of Penny Dreadfuls, and someone found a scrapbook with all his reviews, and the reviews of Varney were there with all the other reviews of Rymer's things, and that was the key in attributing it to Rymer. So that was wrongly catalogued. Obscure literary periodicals where stories had lain unpublished since the mid-19th century. Obscure collections of stories, including one by a man called Eric Count Stenbock, 1890, which actually features a vegetarian vampire, would you believe? So there's nothing new under the sun. Everyone thinks it's invented with Twilight. That's 1890. It's a sort of parody of vampire stories. Looking at the Lord Ruthven plays of the 1820s, there are an awful lot of plays, as we'll see, based upon Polidori's Vampire, and most of them are in the British Museum in French and English. And I well remember, and actually a question in the earlier session reminded me of this. I ordered up a book where its title was in Latin, but in English it was on the tendency of the dead to chew their shrouds in their coffins. And this man sort of brought it to me with white gloves and put it down as if to say, are you seriously reading this stuff? And what's changed is we now think Dracula's great, we now know who wrote Varney. There are entire periodicals devoted to Dracula studies. The 18th century vampire, on the tendency of the dead to chew in their shrouds, is now quite a well-covered area. And actually, if you sit in the new British Library, you can't find anyone who isn't studying the Gothic, particularly in literary studies. So there really has been a lot of change since '78. I redid the book in 1991, but this is the cover of... It changed from Lord Ruthven to Count Dracula to Lord Byron to Count Dracula, because I treated Byron as a fictional figure as well as Dracula in a way. And I added a lot of stuff about the working notes of Bram Stoker, which had been sort of discovered in the meantime, in between the publication of the first and the second edition. So it really is gratifying to see how much has changed. There was very little written on the Gothic, actually, in 1978. There was Montague Summers, his various books, which are highly suspect for lots of reasons. I mean, his Gothic bibliography, it has now been established, contains several items that he made up, and everyone's sort of frantically looking for them. I think he just liked the sound of the title, or someone misinformed him, let's be charitable. There was Montague Summers, Edith Burkhead's Tale of Terror by a literary historian. One or two other things, and a couple of biographies of Bram Stoker, which I'll talk about in a second. But it wasn't easy, actually, to research the Gothic in those days. But in introducing this program I'm going to show and tell you a bit about, I'd like to start with a wonderful quotation from Umberto Eco, the great Italian philosopher and writer, from Reflections on the Name of the Rose. Because I think it helps to put my presentation in the context, as I see it anyway, of this conference. I think of the postmodern attitude as that of a man who loves a very cultivated woman and knows he cannot say to her, I love you madly, because he knows that she knows, and that she knows that he knows, that these words have already been written by Barbara Cartland. Still, there is a solution. He can say to her, as Barbara Cartland put it, I love you madly. At this point, having avoided false innocence, having said clearly that it's no longer possible to speak innocently, he will nevertheless have said what he wanted to say to the woman, that he loves her, but he loves her in an age of lost innocence. When Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in between 1890 and 1897, from his point of view, in a way, it was already a world of lost innocence. People tend to treat this as the sort of foundation vampire novel, but actually it's as much about other vampire stories as it is about some alleged account of what it's really like in Transylvania. There's lots and lots of references to earlier literary and non-literary accounts of the vampire, particularly those set in Transylvania and Austrian Styria. So in some ways, as philosophers put it, it's about second-order meanings rather than first-order meanings in the first place. So already he was writing in an age of lost innocence, but today I think the vampire in Umberto Eco's age of even more lost innocence has become a metaphor for all sorts of things that are very difficult to say directly. And instead of saying, as Barbara Cartland put it, we treat the vampire as the last romantic, we treat the vampire as the last carnivore, at least until Twilight. Okay. And I remember asking my students at the Royal College what scared them about vampires, and they were all vegetarians and vegans, and they said, he eats meat. Anyway, on the ultimate addict, ever since Anne Rice, on a sometimes acceptable predator, as an answer to taboos about death, about fluid identities, questions about the other, and are they fixed, and maybe about the remnants of the sacred in a secular age. And if many critics are to be believed, another thing that the vampire represents is a whopping example of the return of the repressed, in some way, and resistance through rituals all at the same time. So, as metaphors go, it's proved to be fantastically useful in an age where we're not very good at confronting these things directly. You take a sideways step and do the fairy tale version, which is why I think it's so interesting. So I should really call this entire talk, as Bram Stoker put it. By the way, I was thinking earlier that, of course, Dracula walks around Piccadilly in daylight, you know. So Twilight didn't invent that. I mean, you know, it's Bram Stoker got there. I mean, I think he forgot, actually, the rules. But never mind. It brings me to Bram Stoker's Nightmare. I've called this session The Nightmare of Bram Stoker, because I'm going to be introducing and taking you through a television documentary I made in 1995 as part of a series for BBC and the Arts and Entertainment Network called Nightmare. Just a footnote, it's quite interesting. You put up ideas to these television companies, and sometimes, particularly in the United States, where the centre of television is New York, the centre of the movies is California, but you're in New York, and very often they feel that a subject doesn't suit a particular nationality of presenter. You know, why isn't it an American presenter? With the Gothic and nasty things, they immediately associate it with England. So you walk into the room and they imagine you in a tweed suit wandering around, and sort of Jonathan Harker style. So there was no problem about that at all. They immediately saw the point. And the programme was trying really to do 3 or 4 things. It was partly about Bram Stoker himself, who is a very difficult figure to get the hang of. Partly about the story of vampires in literature, up to 1890, and specifically about the genesis of Dracula. But above all, it was about what the metaphor of vampires might have meant to Bram Stoker himself. Now, at that time, there were only 2 biographies of Stoker published. There's now 4. There was one by a man called Harry Ludlam, called A Biography of Dracula, the life story of Bram Stoker, published in 1962. And Daniel Farson's book, The Man Who Wrote Dracula, A Biography of Bram Stoker, published in 1975. Barbara Belford's Bram Stoker didn't come out till late 96, when the programme was actually on the air. And Paul Murray's From the Shadow of Dracula didn't appear until 2004. Poor old Bram Stoker, he wrote lots and lots of other books, but all the biographies are always called Shadow of Dracula, The Life of Dracula, The Life Story of Dracula. He can't get out from under. I mean, you know, I know vampires aren't supposed to cast a shadow, but Dracula casts a very long shadow on Bram Stoker's life. Ludlam's really was a very genial account of a larger-than-life man of the theatre, centring on his career as the manager of the Lyceum Theatre off the Strand. That's where the Lion King has taken up residence, you know, for a very long time. Ludlam corresponded with Noel Thornley Stoker, who was Bram Stoker's son, Bram's only child, And Noel confirmed that it was indeed a nightmare that triggered the writing of Dracula, at least according to family legend, but added that it was a nightmare that came after a late night supper of dressed crab after a show at the Lyceum, and the crab was obviously slightly off, and Bram Stoker had a very difficult night, and what you get is Dracula. Stoker, actually it turns out that the letter in which Noel Stoker wrote to Harry Ludlam reminding him of this, it does begin by saying Stoker was joking when he said it. So although it's become sort of folkloric and all these books sort of include it, it was supposed to be a kind of throwaway line. But never mind, that was the nearest that Harry Ludlam got to any kind of explanation. That Stoker had melodrama in his blood, he lived and breathed the theatre, and when he had this nightmare, out it came, as a part that Henry Irving might well have played. Daniel Farson's biography was very, very different. He's the great-nephew of Bram Stoker, and in those days a well-known television presenter and a close friend of Francis Bacon. And he does two things in the book. He says that it's been over-analysed, because by the time his book came out, in 1975, Marxism and Freudianism and feminism had begun to enter studies of the Gothic, particularly on American campuses. So Farson spends half the book doing a sort of rearguard action, saying, you know, everyone's over-interpreting the book, it isn't about sexuality, you know, Stoker liked censorship and he was a repressed Victorian gentleman, and the other half presenting Bram Stoker as a huge bundle of neuroses himself, who somehow didn't carry them over into the book, which is slightly odd. Maybe it is suggested that Stoker had a desire to eat his younger siblings when he was a child, or maybe he had an Oedipus complex about his boss, Henry Irving. And a slight whiff of misogyny, because Daniel Farson suggests that Mrs. Stoker, Florence, was, quote, as cold and frigid as a statue, with irregular menstrual patterns, and so Bram sought solace elsewhere, which is why he died of syphilis. Actually, it hasn't been established that he died of syphilis, but it is possible to interpret his death certificate in that way. So it's a very odd thing in this book that you know, half the book is saying don't over-interpret Dracula, and then you've got this extraordinary picture of this Victorian with all these neuroses. And on the last page, Farson says, Bram Stoker eludes me, which is quite something after writing a large biography, you know. And he's right. So what was the wellspring of his interest in vampirism? Well, the origins of my nightmare, the programme, lay partly in the fact that I felt that Stoker and Dracula hadn't really been on mainstream television, and it was time they were. But it was my perception that no one seemed to have got anywhere near Stoker's inner life, as distinct from his professional life as a theatrical manager. And if it started anywhere, it started with this quote from a literary critic called Ludovic Flo, which I think is quite brilliant, actually. This is about Stoker. He is a master of the commonplace style in which clichés flow as if they were impelled by the same pressure as genius. I don't say this lightly. There's a semi-heroic, everyman quality about his intense command of the mediocre, as if the commonplace had found a champion who could wear its colours with all the ceremony of greatness. When such a man, just once, is thoroughly afraid, the charade stops dead, and what you get is Dracula. Which I think, okay, people are beginning to reinterpret Stoker's other books. There's a new edition of The Mystery of the Sea that says it's wonderful. I think it's almost unreadable, but anyway. And everyone's busily bringing out sort of minor Bram Stokers and things. Well, fair enough, but there's nothing to touch the quality of Dracula, and it's one of the great enigmas of his life. So that was really the thing that kick-started me, and it seemed to confirm what Bram Stoker wrote in his manuscript working notes, which came to light in the late 1970s, having been sold by Florence Stoker shortly after her husband's death in 1913. She cleared the house and sold it at Sotheby's. And they were housed in the Rosenbach Library in Philadelphia. And what was exciting about the discovery in the late 70s of the Stoker papers was there's so little primary material about Bram Stoker. You know, there's lots of reviews of the plays he was involved in. There's lots of letters, but they're usually 2 lines. Thank you very much for your letter to Mr. Irving. You know, that's about it. There's hundreds of those. And lots of signed editions. He loved signing books. In fact, in some cases, the rare ones are the ones without his signature. But there's so little primary material. And here were the working notes, which was what he read, how he turned what he read into passages in the book, and how he turned those passages in the book into the finished novel. So it really was a remarkable insight into the creative process. And what it And what it showed, beyond doubt, was that he started work on it in March 1890, and it was published in 1897. So, whereas all his other books were usually written on his summer holidays, this one took him 7 years to read about and write, and that was a big discovery. Secondly, that it was set in the year 1893. He's very meticulous about this. You know, Dracula begins with a sort of railway timetable and a recipe, and Bram Stoker was that sort of guy. He was a clerical-minded person, and anyway, 1893. But also, in my view, and I think Elizabeth Miller has confirmed this, that what the notes show was the nightmare that's kick-started the novel, and it was there from the very beginning. In March 1890, the very first note that he took, Bram Stoker wrote on a piece of scrap paper in his extraordinarily difficult handwriting, "Young man goes out, sees girls, one tries to kiss him, not on the lips, but throat. Old Count interferes, rage and fury diabolical. This man belongs to me, I want him." And that's where it started. That's his first note. 6 days later, he reiterated, loneliness, the kiss, this man belongs to me. Again, a couple of months later, in one of the many structures of the book he wrote down, actually the structure of the whole of the first part of the novel, Bistreets, Borgo Pass, Castle, belongs to me. So the incident is so important, it's actually a key aspect of the structure of the book. And again he writes, sometimes in shorthand, and the visitors, is it a dream? Women stoop to kiss him, terror of death. Suddenly Count turns her away. This man belongs to me. May 15th, Monday, women kissing. Book 1, chapter 8, belongs to me. And whatever the changes that happened to the novel in the intervening 7 years, and there were many changes, that remains constant in all his notes. And so when Bram Stoker's son Noel said it was kick-started by a nightmare, he may well have been right. But the nightmare wasn't because of dressed crab, it was something to do, in my view anyway, with this. A tug of war about Bram Stoker's sexuality. That on the one hand, the three, I don't have to read the passage, do I? You probably know it backwards. Do you know it backwards? Yeah, nodding heads. I was going to read it, but I thought, no, I won't do that. It takes too long. But, you know, the three vampire young ladies, as he calls them, come in. One of them bends over him and he says, you know, I have this longing at the same time as a deadly fear. And her lips actually touch his skin, and he has this incredible erotic thrill, at which point Big Daddy comes in with blazing red eyes. This man belongs to me. And it's an extraordinary moment in the novel, and as I say, one of the things I thought about with this programme was presenting that as Bram Stoker's nightmare. Without actually interpreting it, it's up to the audience to decide what on earth all that means. So I think this ambiguous moment, all right, it's a fantasy, we don't know, it was a nightmare, it was a fantasy. But as I say, there was very little written about Dracula to help me at the time. You know, I had to sort of wade through Montague Summers, and Devendra P. Varma, The Gothic Flame, was published in the 50s. Mario Praz, The Romantic Agony, which I always found very useful. That was actually published in 1933, but it came out in paperback in the 60s and became rather a trendy book, The Romantic Agony. David Peary used the structure of The Romantic Agony to apply to Hammer films in the heritage of horror. You know, it became a sort of organising device. So, that was the starting point. But I also became very fascinated by the visualization of horror. How do you... Okay, the notes were telling me about how Bram Stoker's reading turned into the novel, but how do we visualize that from the printed page? Because if ever there was a myth that's been visualized, it's the myth of the vampire. And I started a lot of research into the visualization of horror, which actually culminated eventually. Some of you may have seen it. I curated an exhibition at Tate Britain about 4 years ago on Gothic nightmares, about Fuseli's painting The Nightmare, and the visual Gothic. You know, what was going on while all these Gothic novels were being written? What were the artists doing? Well, there was a huge, I mean, all the critics said they were second 11 paintings, and it's quite interesting that I think the visual Gothic is at about the same stage that the literary Gothic was in the 70s. It'll come, but all that was going on at the same time, and art historians hadn't really noticed, which was interesting. So I wanted to show you some examples of the visualization of horror by way of a sort of prologue, and then I'm going to take you through the programme. Okay. Arnold Böcklin, The Isle of the Dead. Symbolist painting, late 19th century, much rated in Germany and North Europe. Skull Island from King Kong. Now, what tended to happen when they were making films was, in the Hollywood Golden Age, you had a research department. And the research department in the studio would be asked to produce what was known as a Bible, which is a collection of postcards, transparencies, art reproductions, newspaper cuttings on a particular project. And you'd give the Bible to the production designer and to the costume designer. And very, very often, the Bible contained paintings of a certain kind. It's not that they were interested in art history, it was a quick way of sorting out their design properly. You know, they're making 17 horror movies in a year, and they've got to do it quickly. So that's Skull Island. Grandville's illustration from Gulliver's Travels, which was in the Bible for King Kong. I hate to disillusion you, but that was him going up the Empire State Building. Caspar David Friedrich, a man and woman staring at the moon. A great German nationalist painting, The Oak, representing the nation. Student of Prague, 1926. Tom Sawyer, 1938. That tree keeps turning up in Hollywood films. It's even in Snow White. Bauhaus, Oskar Schlemmer's costume design, 1922. And you could relate that to perhaps Nosferatu, but we'll see in a minute. But the most powerful one in this world that we're talking about is Fuseli's painting, The Nightmare. 1781, exhibited at the Royal Academy, caused a basic confusion in the language about what a nightmare is. Everyone thought it was the horse. It's actually the creature sitting on her chest. The horse is his vehicle. This blind horse has brought him through the curtains, and he sits on her chest and stares out in this strange way at the viewer. So he's the nightmare, not the horse, but people thought nightmare meant female horse after this painting. I think probably the makeup for Nosferatu came from Fuseli's painting. Here's, now, your starter for 10. The middle image, Francis Bacon's Figures at the Base of the Crucifixion, 1944. Alien. And Hans Rudi Giger actually admitted this, the surrealist designer. Edward Hopper, The House by the Rain. You get this one? Do you? Do I hear Psycho? Yeah. And it was taken directly from the painting. Again, the production designer acknowledged this. But here's Fuseli again. Frankenstein, 1931. Instead of the horse at the window, it's Karloff. They even put it on the poster. It was such a strong image. Edison, Frankenstein, 1910, the very first narrative horror movie worth the name. Even that might be from The Nightmare. Caligari, 1919. Nosferatu, production drawing by Albin Grau, 1923. The thing is, what's interesting, I think, is that a lot of production designers, in Hollywood anyway, came from Northern Europe. They came from Germany and Scandinavia, and were on the run from the Nazis and came over to Hollywood and brought with them their culture of Northern European art. So you get a lot of references to Berkeley and Fuseli and Munch and all these people who weren't necessarily very highly rated by the art establishment, but that was the visual culture of the production designers. And I always find someone ought to study that. It's interesting. And that's so Fuseli, I think, that moment in Nosferatu. Yeah, I love this one. It's Dorothy Lamour in a South Seas adventure taken from Joannier Rousseau's, you know, the Gypsy with the Lion. You know that painting? Yeah, I think it's in the Met in New York, or MoMA. Anyway. You get lots of big cats and ladies. This is the, I'm sure you know this, but this is the only illustration of Frankenstein that we know Mary Shelley actually saw. It's from the popular edition of Frankenstein, 1831. With lots of interesting things about it. I mean, the research student is very young on the right, and the creature is quite beautiful, like sort of Vitruvian man, you know. And he becomes ugly because people treat him as ugly. But anyway, but that's a huge problem for a filmmaker. It's a very complicated thought. So you've got to make him a bit of a monster in the first place, so you kind of know he's the bad guy. So you get this, and that happened quite. You know, the first major version of Frankenstein, 1931. The Bible for this production at Universal Studios included this image, which is from Goya, Lost Chinchilla. And I think, I can't establish the fact, but I think that Karloff's makeup came from this guy, who's a lunatic Spanish aristocrat locked up in an asylum, a satirical thing about the effete aristocracy, the decadent aristocracy. And so you get that. Of course, the other thing you have to do is to have scars and bolts and all these literal things that Mary Shelley didn't have to worry about. She just said, in fact, the operation sequence in the book is just one line: I gathered the instruments of life about me, full stop. It's 10 minutes in the movie. You know, you've got to have, generators, batteries, lightning arcs, lightning, eagle, sort of winding. You've got to have all that, and you've got to have the scars and the bolt, because everyone's very literal watching films. They want to know how it happened, which of course Mary Shelley wasn't remotely interested in. Okay, obviously in the programme we had to, in visualising all this, we had to go to the Villa Diodati on Lake Geneva, where it all began in 1816, in June 1816, where Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, Polidori, Claire Clairmont, and Mary Godwin, as she then was, scared the pants off one another. It was raining very hard, and they were trapped indoors, and they got very fractious, and they got on each other's nerves, and they decided to have a sort of family bet who could tell the nastiest story. And the 17-year-old Mary Godwin came up with the creation scene from Frankenstein, and everyone was just completely gobsmacked. They really didn't think she could possibly have such thoughts. What's ironic about the Villa Diodati, though, when we filmed there, it belongs to a Belgian squillionaire. We filmed there for a weekend. It was jolly interesting, actually. There's where, see it at the top of the hill, overlooking Lake Geneva, at the top there on the right. But the inside is fantastically sort of elegant and non-sinister. And we were hoping it would look like, something out of, The Bride of Frankenstein. Remember the beginning of The Bride of Frankenstein, perched on a hill, and you get the wind whistling, and there's Byron, and what beautifully dramatic, it's incredibly Gothic. But no, it's like sort of the world of interiors. Now, it may not have been like that then, but I suspect it probably was. So we had to rough it up a little bit in the programme, as you'll see. But it was wonderful to have the opportunity to work in there, including the basin in Mary Godwin's room, which is still there, actually cemented into the wall. This must have been the basin that she washed her face in just after giving Frankenstein, which is a nice moment, actually. That's the Bride of Frankenstein version. And Polidori, as we know, Byron told this story, or a fragment of a story, which was then turned into The Vampire by Polidori, anonymously, about Lord Ruthven. And we heard about him earlier this afternoon. And I mean, the irony, of course, was that this became a bestseller, and it hung around Byron's neck. He resented it terribly. Goethe said it was the English poet's finest work. He didn't even write it, and it's fairly blood and thunder sort of stuff. But you have to have that. That's the origin, really, of the origin, as someone said this afternoon. The origin of the modern vampire is the alleged epidemics of vampirism in Eastern Europe in the early to mid-18th century, and what the philosophers then made of that. But in terms of literature, this is the moment, you had to have that. Then it turns into drama very, very quickly. Because there was no protection of copyright. So everyone wrote a vampire play who felt like it, really. This is Frankenstein, I'm afraid, but there was a double bill, in fact, by 1822 of Frankenstein with the vampire. Already, a horror double bill was on the stage in London in 1822. The Vampire or the Bride of the Isles, very popular play, by Lord Byron, they rather optimistically say. It turns out that the theatrical management were overburdened with some Highland costumes from Scotland, so they reset the whole thing in the Highlands. Now, what's interesting in the programme is that Lord Ruthven was a real person, and I was trying to find out who the existing Lord Ruthven is. And it turned out it was Mrs. Thatcher's Minister for the Arts, Lord Gowrie, is the surviving Lord Ruthven. Right? So I persuaded him to appear as himself in an extract from The Vampire or the Bride of the Isles, in return for a length of Ruthven tartan, which is the Ruthven, it's a very rare tartan. It's rather disappointing, it looks a bit like Bob Hope's golfing trousers. Never mind, I was hoping it would look a bit more old-fashioned. But anyway, here's Lord Gowrie as Lord Ruthven. I thought it was the casting coup of the century to get him playing his ancestor, who had this terrible reputation. Anyway, there we are, filming it. We had to have a Highlander on the stage as well, etc. It was extraordinary. Then Varney, of course, and the arrival in the late 1840s of Reimer's book, which had to be referred to, which it's pretty certain Stoker must have read. There's enough comparisons, I think, with these rather wonderfully lurid woodcuts. And then, of course, getting up to Bram Stoker, where it was very important we filled in the Lyceum background by filming in the Lyceum. If you go to the Lyceum Theatre today, it's actually back to front. In Victorian times, the stage was on the Covent Garden side of the theatre. It's been moved the other way around. So what is now the stage was backstage in those days. And what is now the bit you enter in the foyer was the stage. Do you see what I mean? And so we had to be careful not to claim that we were filming at the Lyceum as Stoker worked in it. And it's interesting, you see, when you make TV programmes, I'd never read that in any book. And only when we really started making the programme, where we had to find out whether it was real, did I find this out. So you do actually get quite a lot of research done. This is a piece of sheet music, which was a piece of merchandising to tie in with Irving's Faust, which had this astonishing 20-minute sequence on the Brocken, this hill, Walpurgisnacht. It took, the scene changes apparently took 20 minutes. You had this 20-minute dumb show with Irving standing there as Mephistopheles, surrounded by bats, rabbits for some reason, and all sorts of electric lights, of course, which was the new innovation. And then another 20-minute gap while they struck the stage, and then the play, they went back to the play, and so on. But anyway, yeah, that's the Brocken scene from Faust. And then to Whitby, because Stoker started in March 1890. In summer 1890, he went on his holes to Whitby with Florence and the young Noel, where he stayed for 3 weeks and seems to have worked very hard on his novel. A lot of the notes are from Whitby. He went to the cemetery, jotted down the names of a lot of the gravestones, and Mr. Swales and all these names, you know, he picked up on them. Went to the local library and philosophical society and got a dictionary of Whitby slang. And being Stoker, I mean, it comes out in chunks in the novel. I mean, the fisherman stands there and uses all these incredibly obscure words, you know, in a way that human beings don't tend to, but he had to get all his slang in. And he wrote it down. But the main thing was, you know, you have to ask yourself, when someone's on their summer holiday in a nice seaside town in Yorkshire, why do they pick up a book called An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldonia by William Wilkinson, late British consul, president of Book? I mean, I don't know how it happened, but this is Dracula's birth certificate, you know, in the sense that up till now it was Count Vampire in the notes, and there's a footnote in this book which is the reference to Vlad the Impaler, you know, Vlad Dracula. Dracula in the Romanian language means devil. There's about 3 lines on it, and that's the sole note in Stoker's notes that is about Vlad. You know, everyone thinks that he went to Romania or studied Romania. He didn't. He liked the name. He liked the sound of it. And it's an interesting question about if it was called Count Vampire, whether it was actually still in print. It's such a good name. Anyway, he found it in this book on his summer holidays in 1890. Thereafter, from 1893 onwards, he went on his summer holidays to Cruden Bay on the Buchan coast in Scotland, near Aberdeen, and stayed in this hotel, the Kilmarnock Arms Hotel. And in fact, they've still got the visitors' book in the local library with Stoker and his family signing in. Because Stoker was so busy as a theatrical manager, he spent his summer holiday, well, I think researchers know this one, he frantically was writing during his summer holidays. And he distilled a lot of his creative work into that 3-4 week period. And so his holidays are actually rather important. Because just across the way from the Kilmarnock Arms Hotel, now we're in the realms of speculation, is this castle. It's called Slains Castle. It's a ruin now, although it was actually in action in 1893, belonging to the House of Errol, and it's very spooky. It's on it might be Castle Dracula, I don't know. But anyway, we had to watch the programme. Then to the British Library, the round reading room of sainted memory. And as I say, studying the Gothic there at this time was a bit like a scene from Night of the Demon, you know. But anyway, we think that Bram Stoker found this pamphlet, the one pamphlet, original pamphlet about Vlad that was in the British Museum at that time, according to the catalogue, is this one, published in Bamberg. And if you hear Stoker's description of Dracula, it is possible that he saw this. His face was a strong, very strong aquiline, with a high bridge of a thin nose and peculiarly arched nostrils, with lofty, domed forehead, and hair growing scantily round the temples, that's not right, but profusely elsewhere. His eyebrows were massive, almost meeting over the nose, and with bushy hair that seemed to curl in its own profusion. The mouth, so far as I could see it under a heavy moustache, was fixed and rather cruel looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. The general effect was one of extraordinary pallor. Now, it is possible, that he's describing what he'd seen at the British Library. I don't put it any more firmly than that. But anyway, so we had to go to the British Library and have a look at this pamphlet. Here's Vlad in action, having a picnic. Then off to Romania. And the one major mistake I made in the programme, and I got lots of letters, you get letters from all sorts of people, was I was trying to make the point that that Stoker had never been to Romania. He'd read a few books in the British Library, The Land Beyond the Forest and all these other things. But I said that by 1897, Stoker had never been east of Whitby. And everyone wrote to me, he said, Essex is east of Whitby. I mean, London's east of Whitby. But I was trying to make a sort of poetic point, anyway, it didn't work. There we are. I said, it's still in the programme. So off to Romania to look at the real Castle Dracula, which of course isn't in Transylvania, it's in Wallachia, and he wasn't a count, he was a voivod, and all sorts of other things, because it was just the name, basically. But we had to go there. Yeah. Now, this is the only British illustration of Dracula we know that Bram Stoker saw. It's the paperback edition of, is it, hang on, 1901? I can't remember. Anyway, it's the paper, it's cut down, he abridged it, it's now come out again as an abridged version. And that description of Dracula, it's very interesting. There he is with his military moustache. He looks like sort of C. Aubrey Smith, in Hollywood films, the guy who plays the elderly colonel. There he is with these very large feet and large hands as he shins down the battlements. And there's Jonathan Harker looking at him on the top left. So we can imagine this approximates to how Bram Stoker saw the Count. An elderly military commander, a bit like an updated version of Vlad. This is the first American illustration which picks up on it. And because it's more watercolory, you actually get the face in stronger relief. But of course, when it comes to the cinema, the visualization of this is seriously strange. I mean, Nosferatu, okay, they might have been covering their tracks because they hadn't cleared the copyright, and they changed the name of Dracula to Count of Orlok and Harker to Hutter and all this sort of thing. But he's bald, he's got teeth like a rodent, he's got the ears of a bat, he's this sort of strange creature of folklore, which is quite brilliant, but nothing to do with what Bram Stoker wrote. And already some fairly remarkable he also throws a very long shadow. Yeah. Famously, in the scene where he goes up the stairs, the whole point of the shot is his shadow. And then, of course, in 1931 too, Bela Lugosi, and it premiered on Valentine's Day in Hollywood and New York. Love at the First Bite, or something like this, most extraordinary sort of thing. And here we get, for the first time, evening dress, clean-shaven, lounge lizard, rather than the kind of lizard that goes down the battlements. But this idea of wearing evening dress and a very strange combination of imagery, where there he is at the foot of the stairs of Castle Dracula, and an armadillo walks by. And you think, are they in Texas? I mean, anyway, obviously there was a pet armadillo at Universal Studios, as they let loose. He wanders around at the foot of the stairs and everything. But the cloak, the evening dress, and the sort of hypnotic quality very much comes through in this. So he's no longer an elderly field commander, and he's no longer this creature of folklore from Nosferatu. He's become, in quotes, seductive. And then, of course, Christopher Lee. Now, I was very keen to have references to Hammer films in this programme. As you'll see, the credits at the beginning are a parody of Hammer. And the very first sequence of the film, we went to Black Park, Windsor, and actually used the coach, because the coachman was still there, that he supplied for all the Dracula films for Hammer. When the hearse hurtles through the countryside, we did the sequence with that coach, and I sort of enjoyed that. I'm sure nobody got it, but never mind. And Black Park with its very distinctive trees and everything. So, yeah, this is just some shots of us making the film. I was pretending to sail on Lake Geneva. There I am with the ex-Minister for the Arts, wandering around Whitby, Kilmarnock Arms. Yeah, in order to do the different interpretations of Dracula, we thought, how do you visualise that? So we went to Maresfield Gardens, where Freud lived in the 1930s, and I'm actually lying on Freud's couch and sort of talking to the camera saying, some people think, this, that and the other. I don't think anybody got it, but it was quite an exciting day actually, filming on the actual couch in a tweed suit, etc. And this is, of course, a Golders Green columbarium, where the rather nondescript urn holds the ashes of Bram Stoker and his son, Noel. As I say, we wanted to tip our hat to Hammer. Just anything else about the programme I haven't mentioned, finally. We begin with these credits, Black Park. Oh, we wanted to give Stoker an Anglo-Irish voice. Very often in these documentaries you get Royal Shakespeare voice, in voiceover. It's terribly important. I did a programme about King Tut, and we gave Howard Carter a Norfolk accent, because that's where he grew up. And I got letters saying, surely he spoke better than that. But we wanted to give him an Irish voice, because Stoker spent the first 30 years of his life in Ireland, so he would have had an Irish accent. Off to Philadelphia to look at the papers. Romania, yes, the funny thing in Romania was, I wanted to make the point about how films often get how vampires bite wrong. That, I don't know how they bit really, but if you think about it logically, it would have been like a rodent, where you've got an upper tooth and a lower tooth, and a fold of skin between both of them, and you tear at it, which is what rats do. Instead of which, Christopher Lee always had two fangs at the top, and he wouldn't be able to get them out, like this, which is very peculiar. Nosferatu actually got that right, with two very sharp teeth. And I wanted to explain this in a way that wasn't too camp, in the programme. So we took a wolf's skull from the Natural History Museum to Romania. So I'm standing in a farmyard in Romania with a cow actually just behind me, trying to explain about this thing. And you haven't lived till you try to get a wolf skull through the customs in Bucharest, I can tell you. It's very, very strange. Anyway, that was a sequence there, all about how they bite. Highgate Cemetery. Yeah, there's a big dispute about whether the story of Elizabeth Siddal is true or not. The legend was that the poet Rossetti, buried her with a book of love poems, and that he changed his mind because he wanted to publish them. So he got her dug up with Home Office permission, and she hadn't decomposed. She looked radiant, that as the coffin was opened. There's a description by Hall Caine, Stoker's friend, about this, and as the coffin was opened, she looked absolutely radiant, and then she decomposed before their very eyes. And there's some dispute about whether it happened quite like that, but that's certainly what Stoker would have heard through Hall Caine, so we had to do that. Maresfield Gardens, and we finished up at Ealing Studios for the bit about the afterlife of vampires in a commercial way. So that's the background to this. It went out around Christmas time. Final story about it. The credits have a cemetery and a smoke machine in fog, and garish lights because it's sort of Hammer time. And there's a tomb laid into the grass which says Dracula incised on it. And we did one of these for each of the programmes. Frankenstein, Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, together at last, and the Hound of the Baskervilles, obviously a dog cemetery, anyway. And so we had this, and it was December the 23rd, 1995. And I could see that the crew wanted to get home. It was Christmas time, and they were all looking at their watches. And the moment we finished filming the credits, holding a flaming torch and all this, they rushed off in their vans and left the tombs behind. So I got a phone call from the vicar on Christmas Day saying all his parishioners had arrived for the midnight service, and there was Dracula, Frankenstein, in the graveyard. They weren't amused, actually. And I had to drive down to Teddington, South London, to pick up these huge slabs of expanded polystyrene, which they'd left behind. Anyway, that's a treat in store. So we're just going to get the DVD going, and we'll watch Nightmare, if we might, having explained how we did it all. Yeah.